Welcome to JS Podcast number 96, brought to you by Audible. Audible is where you go if you want an audiobook, and as a listener of this podcast, that entitles you to a free 30-day trial and a free book that you can keep forever, even if you decide you don't want to continue with Audible services. You can claim this by visiting audibletrial.com/GS, and it also helps to support this fine podcast, which brings you another great guest in February. I'll be speaking to Ella Whelan on this episode. Ella's the assistant editor over at Spiked Online. I'm always very pleased to see her turn up on my Sunday morning television. Very smart and articulate defender of, well, absolute freedom of expression, really. And this is a quality I find lacking in people at the moment, at a time when it's probably extremely important. We'll be talking about free speech, hate speech laws, cultural appropriation, the Labour Party, Brexit, and a whole host of other topics. I really enjoyed speaking to Ella, and I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing from her, so make sure you send her some love and some kind words on Twitter. You can find her at Ella_M_Whelan. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy!
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the God of Creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, and go A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Ella Whelan to the JS Podcast. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. I'm glad I've got you on. I'm always pleased to see when you're on TV that you offer an absolute defence of free speech. So I'm really looking forward to touching on that and seeing where you fall in terms of the limits of free speech. But for my listeners who are not familiar with your work, maybe you can tell us what you do at Spiked. How would you describe the work you do?
Yeah, so I'm the assistant editor at Spiked. Spiked is an online magazine that fights for freedom, and one of our main areas is that we fight for free speech, no ifs, no buts. That means that we stand up for the free speech of people that we hate as much as we agree with. And it's an unpopular opinion at the moment, but it's something that we see has to be at the heart of a free society.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, how are you navigating this whole fake news hysteria that seems to be taking hold of publications at the moment? Is that something you're delving into, you're looking at, or do you think it's blown out of proportion?
Well, the fake news thing is really interesting because on the one hand, the proliferation of fake news is a problem because fake news is essentially bad journalism. And as an online magazine, we hold good journalism to a high account. We think that journalism should seek the truth, should be, very well researched, should be thoughtful. And the proliferation of fake news and far-fetched and ridiculous stories is an issue because it's denigrating what journalism is. But what's far more worrying, really, is the reaction to fake news. And that reaction tends to be attempts to define what is and isn't truth, to try and put limits on the press, especially, to try and say that, external bodies should decide what should decide what is and isn't fake news. And that's really terrifying because you can have good journalism under that's, sanctioned by the state, but to have great and free journalism, it must be free from state sanction, free from, sort of authoritarian rule. It has to be free to, and journalists have to be free to publish what they think, even if they are, gossiping and untrue sometimes.
How do you feel the internet's affected journalism? Because it seems to me like it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can reach a greater audience, you can spread information quicker. And then on the other hand, I tend to see a lot of people engaging in what's quite clearly, I suppose you'd call it clickbait. It seems to be they have an advertising quota to pander to, and I think that really can affect output. I mean, what effect do you think that's had, and how do we combat this kind of thing?
Well, the internet, as we see it at Spiked, is a fantastic tool that's allowed people to communicate and much more easily. It's been sort of a great boon for democracy because it means that much more people can have a say in political debate, especially with things like Twitter and social media. But there certainly has been a kind of, I think, like I said before with fake news, a sort of degrading of journalism in that people seem to not particularly take it very serious as a sort of, as quite a serious force in the world. Producing news and reporting on stories is an essential part of how we form our political opinions, especially on the kind of new trend of doing things via Twitter, which is on the one hand really great. People are having conversation. On the other hand, so much of our politicians and so many of our elected representatives take their political cue from things that people say on Twitter, from things that news outlets say on Twitter. It's just the kind of the role that journalism is playing today is going in a different direction, and some of that is really great and some of that has its drawbacks. But I think what we can do, especially from Spike's point of view, is to argue for free speech, argue that people should be able to publish and say whatever they like, but that you have a kind of a moral argument as well as a political argument that says you have a duty to, especially as a journalist, produce what you believe to be true and to kind of consider what political impact your argument is having. At Spiked, we believe in free speech, not just because we think that, any sort of nasty person should be able to say what they want. They should. That's free speech. But more importantly, it's so that you can kind of progress politics, that you can change the world, so that you can, enact bigger and better ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Twitter's like a fantastic tool, and I probably spend far too much time on it. But how do you see the future of that platform? Everything I read at the moment seeming to tell me that usage is down, it's not making any money. Can you see any big changes coming, or the end of Twitter?
I think it's going in a really bad direction because there's more and more calls now, and Twitter is answering them, to put in place sanctions, regulations, and basically both Twitter and Facebook are at the forefront of attacks on free speech online. The other day I posted an article which was about the generation divide, and the photo that I used was of an old man's hands holding a stick, and Twitter flagged it as sensitive material, so nobody could see the picture unless they clicked on it. It's sort of really bizarre, but it must be one of their sort of automatic ways of dealing with what they deem to be sensitive content. And even though that's a bit of a silly example, it actually made me sit back and think, wow, I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff I probably couldn't post on here. And I think if Twitter continues to go down this sort of very regulated, very censorious route, it's really going to turn people off because, whereas we'll always have sort of, as they're called, Twitter trolls who will post bizarre and horrible things, most people will be just kind of engaging in sometimes heated debate, sometimes having a laugh. And if they are continuously being censored and continuously being blocked and things like that, then they're just going to leave it.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Because they have to be seen to be doing something to combat this, so-called trolling. Yet they can't have the manpower, surely, for individual cases to be reviewed by humans. So it just seems like an automatic system. I mean, to give an example, I think I've been suspended from Twitter about 6 times, I think. I've not ever used a single swear word on Twitter in my life. Have you any idea how hard it is not to swear on Twitter? So, and I'd always get the email through to say that I'd been suspended for targeted harassment or abuse, and I'd reply back saying I don't feel that's true. Have you got any examples? And then they'd just apologise and reinsert my account straight away. So, I mean, that's a good topic to talk about, trolling. I've heard you speak about this on the Big Questions, and I'm I'm one of them people who's fairly thick-skinned. I think Twitter gives you the tools to deal with that kind of thing. You can mute, you can block, you can respond, you can log out. How do you feel about this this topic of trolling?
Yeah, I completely share your opinion there that it's so easy to block out stuff. And not only that, but it's, I mean, in terms of practically by clicking a button on Twitter, but you also have the capabilities as an adult, because we're talking about adults here. You know, children are a whole different ballpark. They should be sort of, you know, regulated by their parents on how much internet they get. But in terms of adults, you have the option to not look at your notifications, you know, to not set your phone ringing every time someone tweets you. You can deal with these things in a completely reasonable and rational way, and nobody likes to have nasty stuff said to them. I certainly don't. I get it on Twitter, but you know, I don't wake up in the morning with a smile on my face ready to read someone being horrible to me online. But at the same time, you accept that this is the price for, this is the cost of living in a free society. And it's a very, very, very small price to pay for such an important thing as the freedom to express yourself. Trolling has taken on such a strange sort of level of importance in society. I mean, for such a small bunch of losers on the internet to be kind of directing a political narrative in such a strong way is just absolutely shocks me. And the thing that really upsets me and really makes me angry is that so much of the, you know, panic about trolling is framed in terms of protecting women. So we have, I think it was 2 years ago, Yvette Cooper, Labour MP, set up a thing called Reclaim the Internet, which was calling on not only Twitter and Facebook, but the police to get involved with protecting women online. So in response to a couple of stupid freaks online, we're calling for the police to actually be involved in what women can and can't see on the internet. Now, that's infinitely, infinitely more sexist than idiot can come out with on Twitter, because that's saying that as women, we can't handle trolls, that we have to have the, you know, big brother state looking after us. And that just, it gives me shivers, because that's just so insulting.
I completely agree. It's this painting women as the victim in the situation. I mean, I don't know if it was a couple of days ago, I read an article in a prominent newspaper, I forget which was saying that online trolling's forcing women out of politics. And I thought that's a very strange claim to be making, the fact that these people think they can handle political discourse and criticism, but they can't handle a few nasty tweets.
Yeah, so I think that was in relation to Diane Abbott, who kind of came after the sort of furore with David Davis and his texts about her. She's come out and said, I'm going to spill all now. Actually, I get a huge amount of abuse online, sexist and racist, she says, which may very well be true. But the thing is that's really worrying that's happening with the politicians' response to Twitter and social media is that, yes, they will occasionally get the odd person being really quite abhorrent, but most of the time, the sort of what they deem to be abuse that they get online is actually people disagreeing with them, and people disagreeing with them in quite a heated but normal way. So, I mean, I've had a go at some of our MPs on the internet because I feel really strongly about what they're doing. And Twitter is sort of a great leveler because it means you can tweet at somebody, you can tweet at a politician, and they may very well see it. And so that's something that I think is great. But the politicians turn against that to say that actually, and it comes from women, it comes from people like Yvette Cooper, Jess Phillips, Diane Abbott. They've all sort of made noises about how people shouldn't be allowed to say mean things to me. Now, what that really is saying, because not everybody is sort of sending sexist and racist abuse to Diane Abbott, certainly not. But what that really is saying is that I don't want to be confronted with ideas that I don't like. And it's really cowardly and it's really anti-democratic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, how do you feel about the UK's hate speech laws and this idea that we could get a knock on the door from a police officer just for tweeting out the wrong thing?
Yeah, I mean, if there was a law that I could tomorrow by some sort of authoritarian power that was given to me, it would be hate speech laws. I think they're absolutely awful. It's at its core saying that emotions have to be policed, that hate has to be stopped. And hate in politics is really powerful. You know, people in the past have hated their living conditions and so have gone out and fought for, you know, the better wages, for kind of better living standards. People have hated their political representation and have, you know, fought back against that. People have, you know, people hate racism, people hate sexism, people hate bigotry, and so they go out and march against it and make arguments against it. Hate is a driving force in politics. It's a very important human emotion that cannot be policed and should never be policed. And so the idea that you would have law that says that hateful speech is illegal is just completely, you know, it's anti-politics. It's completely misunderstanding what human communication is about, and completely underestimating the role of, you know, heated, angry, hateful debate sometimes. You know, the other thing to say about hate speech is that the definitions are just broadening every day. So it's not just the kind of standard things that you could think of, like the N-word, or, you know, really calling someone something Islam homophobic. It's not the kind of things that first pop into your head as abhorrent speech. It's calling, you know, women slags. It's, you know, saying rude things to people. It's sort of stuff that's still not very nice, but certainly isn't necessarily hate speech. So, you know, they just cast dint of the law, it casts the net so wide that every day something new can be classed as hate speech. And it should really make people who just believe in freedom and believe that they should be able to say what they like without having the police come knock on their door, really should make us balk.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what do you make of this discussion around hate crime? There's a spike in hate crime post-Brexit. It's usually put in that context. I mean, on one hand, obviously, we want to be a society that prevents these things from happening, or at least seeks justice for victims of hate crime. But on the other, the way it's logged now seems to lend itself to these inflated statistics by the fact that if you just say you're a victim of hate crime, or you think somebody else has been a victim of hate crime, it goes down as a hate crime statistic regardless of whether or not it is a genuine hate crime.
Definitely. I think there's a really big problem with the panic about hate crime. You know, you don't need to say really that if a serious crime happens, it should be reported and dealt with as with any other crime seriously, and justice should be served. That doesn't change whether it's a racist attack or not. You know, a crime is crime. And so the way in which hate crime has been framed means that because of what we've just talked about, the sort of widening definitions of what hate speech, so you have people reporting things like someone shouting something at them on a bus as a hate crime. And now, you know, if someone's shouting something at you on a bus that isn't sort of Islamophobic or racist, but is just like something mean, what is criminal and what is illegal is being completely inflated. After Brexit, the narrative that's happened around, you know, and has been pushed around hate crime has been really, really awful, actually, because what it's served to do is stir up this idea that Brexiteers and people who voted leave are inherently racist and bigots and criminals and violent people, and they want, you know, the UK to descend into some horrible anarchy of hate, which is just completely untrue and completely bigoted itself. You know, painting millions of people as being, you know, hate-filled, awful, immoral people is just really wrong. So the desire to seek high hate crime statistics is fed by a hatred of what has happened in, you know, recent political history. And you really have to take the stats with a pinch of salt. That's not because you don't think that when crimes happen, they should be treated seriously. But it's because actually what's happening isn't giving the truth of the matter. We do not live in a racist and violent country. In fact, we didn't before Brexit. We don't after Brexit. People are, on the whole, good because society has changed over the years. We know anti-racism has made gains through struggle for the last, 50 years. And to say that that's just disappeared overnight and everyone's suddenly, that racists have suddenly come out in people, is totally ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've seen a lot of these, not a handful, I would suggest, of racial abuse on buses, verbal abuse, and these are invariably filmed on a mobile phone. And just to back up what you said about the generally anti-racist society that we have, as soon as these things get made public and viral, everyone's outraged, and the hunt's then on for the perpetrator, and then they're usually dealt with pretty swiftly. And I think that's not the action of a racist society.
Exactly. And, when you watch the videos, so I remember watching one of a couple of quite clearly pissed sort of youngest guys, which doesn't excuse their bad behaviour, but puts it into context, shouting at someone on a bus, shouting racist abuse at someone on a bus. And everybody else on the bus got up and said, "You disgraceful young men, get off.
Oh, yeah.
You don't represent them." So normal people, react to this thing and defend each other. And, you see displays of solidarity every day in terms of that. But there's a kind of sort of interesting thing going on in that this desire and this sort of knee-jerk reaction to immediately film stuff really kind of fascinates me, because it's part of a culture, I think, that's growing that is actually not willing to get stuck in. So the more that we say, oh, hate crimes are on the rise, we're living in a racist society, oh my God, what are we going to do? Oh, film it. Every time you see something, film it and then give it to the police. What it's actually doing is putting a barrier in place when it says, no, don't film it. Go over and clock the guy if he's, abusing someone, or, get involved. Don't film it. Don't be a bystander. Don't be a sort of observer. Get stuck into what's happening in front of you, get stuck into defending people materially. So, it's a small point, but I just think it's interesting that what going hand in hand is this desire to sort of film and document things like this that happen, as well as a desire to sort of up the idea that we've got such a big problem with racism in this country, when actual fact, when these things that rarely happen do happen, people react there and then, and the problem is solved there and then. So the idea that we've got this endemic problem that we don't know how to solve is nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, just to circle back to Brexit came up there, and I thought I'd get your opinion on the way this is being dealt with in the media. It seems like it's destined to fail no matter what, or it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy because of the way it's, I'm reading every morning there's a new horror story, a new disaster, and a new reason why the sky is going to fall as soon as we trigger Article 50. I mean, how do you feel about the way it's being handled in the media?
It's hard not to get really angry about it, actually, because what people who are critical of Brexit have completely missed is that the most important thing about Brexit was not even necessarily leaving the EU, which was crucial and the whole point that it happened. But for Spiked, the really exciting and the really potential-filled thing that happened with it was that so many people, despite being barraged with, lectures on how they had to vote and being told that if they didn't fall in line with the political establishment that there was going to be World War III, and they were going to lose all their money, and they were going to ruin their kids' future, and all this horrendous sort of scapegoating and fear-mongering, stood up and gave two fingers to Westminster and say, we know what we want what we want, give us what we want, and voted to leave the EU. And that sort of simmering anger with the way that politics has been going on for so long, and that desire for change is just so ripe with opportunity and so exciting. I mean, I'm really not even putting it on. The kind of the way Spike sees it is that this is the time in which politics could really change. And so the pessimistic doom and gloom, continual fear-mongering from, you know, certain media commentators about this and so many politicians is just sort of, it's not only disgusting, it just shows how little they care for politics, how little they care about the public, and really how scornful they are of kind of, you know, voters who chose to do this and for the general public. You know, there's been such a strong anti-working class narrative going through the Brexit reaction from people who voted Remain and don't want Brexit to happen. There is a significant amount of people, most people who voted Remain actually, who just want Brexit to happen now because they believe in democracy and they're sort of reasonable people. But those who are continuously trying to thwart it or paint it as something really negative in the media just actually hate these like thickos that voted for Leave that are like probably racist. That narrative is coming through so strongly, and it actually draws, it makes you stop and think, this has been a kind of hidden prejudice in British politics for such a long time. And now it's really come to fruition. You know, you have Guardian journalists posting articles that say, perhaps democracy isn't working. You have cartoonists, you know, for the Times drawing pictures of slathering, what was it? I saw slathering wolves at their kind of computer screens, typing about Brexit, saying that they were sort of didn't have university education. All of the prejudice is coming to the surface like a bad rash. And it's really great actually to see it, because then you can call it out and say, this sort of shit that's been brimming under your kind of perfect exterior for so long is coming out, and we're going to call you out on it. So even though I hate it, I really seethe with anger every time I read something like that, I kind of chalk it up to, this is proof that you are completely out of touch and that you're on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, that's a positive way of looking at it. I mean, how do you feel about the way the left is situated in this argument at the moment? I mean, we've seen a lot of serious issues in America from the left in reaction to Trump, not quite the same here in reaction to Brexit, but you kind of feel like things are close to boiling over in that respect. I mean, I used to be quite fearful of right-wing threats. I always thought violence tended to arise from the far right of the political spectrum, and I'm not so much worried about that at the moment. I'm very concerned about the way the far left's going.
I don't think I'm concerned about the far left because they're so pathetic. And I say that as someone who, you know, spiked would sort of, we used to say that we were left of the left. We have a political history that's very radical and revolutionary, and the kind of last throes of what the UK left wing is now is just so beyond anything that anybody who credibly could call themselves left wing could ever claim to be. They're completely anti-freedom, they're completely anti-democracy, they're scornful of the public, they're scornful of working class people, they're snobby, they're entitled, they're disgusting, and they've completely denigrated any kind of idea of a solid, truthful left-wing politics. And so I definitely don't see them as a threat. I think they're, you know, half dead. You look at the Labour Party, which is just a joke. It's a complete joke. You couldn't write a sitcom better than what's been happening in the Labour Party since Brexit. And it just goes to show that the reason why is not because Jeremy Corbyn is Satan incarnate or anything like this. It's because they just do not understand what people and what working class voters want. They're completely out of touch. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in Stoke, because I just don't see them winning, because they've so soiled their sort of reputation as being on the working class, on the side of the working class again and again and again. They've turned against working class voters. And, you know, you're completely right that actually to freedom and the biggest calls for regulation and sort of shutting down debate and having a very narrow sense of what society should be like used to come from the right. They were the ones that sort of called to have a certain way very prudish, very sort of, conservative. But that's now completely been adopted by the left, from calls for, greater regulation in sex education in schools up to the anti-Brexit stance that so many of them took. There's a sense that there is a right way to live, and that's the kind of way of the metropolitan elite. That's the sort of PC culture, mind your P's and Q's, vote green and kind of be a good little girl sort of thing. And they've completely adopted what the right used to be. They don't pose any challenge at all to what is a sort of concerning growth in right-wing politics, especially in Europe. They don't pose any credible challenge to that. They don't offer anybody a better life. That no left-wing politics now, especially mainstream left-wing politics, offers the public a chance to better their lives, to better politics, to have big ideas. They're completely out of ideas. And I really, really think that they should just be consigned to the dustbin of history, and something new needs to come in its place, because I just don't see a future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the left's pretty much dead at this point. I'm sort of working class from North Manchester, and it was almost an indoctrination when you was younger. You vote Labour for the working class. Labour care about your interest, and I've seen the mood completely change in the last few years on that point, and I can't really see any great swell of support for them, which, like you say, is a shame. It's not this. Just to have an effective opposition is always useful, but they've completely gone AWOL as far as I can see.
Definitely. Most of the prominent left-wing sort of political commentators are now taking interviews with Nick Clegg and laughing along with him at stupid Brexit voters. The fact that so removed, I think, has really shown, because people just are sick of them. And it does, while I think it's a good thing that you have clarity on that, and any sort of defunct political organisation or group like that shouldn't just sort of plod along. We have in invigorating a new sense of left-wing politics is that Labour has sort of zombied on for so many years. But you do long for some kind of an opposition. You do long for, and Spiked certainly is always arguing for a politics that does challenge the things that are wrong with society, and does pose the argument for freedom. So it's kind of sad saying, there's really not a lot on offer to people at the moment. And while it's sad, it should also be a kind of wake up call to ordinary, working people to say we need to do something ourselves, I think, and stop looking to Westminster.
Agreed. Being fully aware that the individual I'm about to mention thrives on, I suppose, being mentioned all the time, and that's Lawyer Annapolis. Now, I'm not as impressed with him as his supporters are, and I've said this before, that I don't think he's quite as evil as his detractors make out. You've shared airtime with him, and unfortunately he's become one of them people who's necessary to keep an eye on, because he's sort of become a proxy by where you can measure the state of free speech. What do you think, what kind of feeling do you have towards this person, this individual? What do you think he means in terms of the way culture is at the moment?
Yeah, as you say, it's frustrating because as an individual I don't think he has anything interesting to say. Politically he's I'd completely disagree with almost everything he believes in. He's not even really that great on free speech, because he has his own lines, and he's, recently been a big supporter of Trump, who is dreadful on free speech. So as Milo Yiannopoulos goes, I really don't have an opinion, because he's just a sort of egomaniac. But the reaction to him has been very interesting and worrying, because people have been actually frightened by this sort of perma-turned egotist. And the things that he says, he has not done anything. All he has said is words, horrible, offensive, all of that kind of stuff, but words. And the idea that, this sort of joker figure could pigeons in such a dramatic way shows how fragile, the kind of groups are who live off identity politics, who say that they're, what's the phrase, triggered, and who say that they can't handle someone like him being at his university. I mean, when I was at university, I would have loved someone like him to come along, just to go and sort of argue with him and laugh at him and sort of ridicule him, because it would be the easiest thing to do. And actually, what's interesting is he has quite a strong following among sort of certain groups of mainly sort of young men on campus. And so there's something going on there which isn't positive at all. And you want to kind of understand that. And the more that people seek to ban him and silence him, that's just feeding he's important, that what he stands for, sort of alt-right politics, are important or dangerous or, should be taking center stage. It's just giving credence to basically what I see as sort of a troll incarnate. He's just an online troll incarnate. Yeah. And, like we've said already, what you do with a troll is you just sort of ignore them because they're not really worth your time. But the panic about him is just mad. And it just goes to show how much you actually do need to stand up for free speech. You do find yourself defending Lawyer Annapolis, which doesn't, because he's a bit of a distasteful character, but it's important.
It doesn't feel good, does it? But somebody's got to do it. So what's going on in terms of academic institutions? And I mean, you mentioned there when you were at uni yourself, you would have welcomed someone like Milo for the reasons to hear what he's got to say and to challenge him. I mean, I when I was at uni as well, it seemed like there was this attitude of, you can't tell us what to do, we'll say and do what we want. This sort of youthful bravado, this rebellion attitude. And now it seems to be the other side of the coin, where there's a lot of actual self-censorship going on, speech codes being implemented by the actual students. What's changed in the last 5-6 years to make this happen, do you think?
Well, Spike is a bit of an expert on this subject, because we run every year an annual free speech university rankings in which we assess all 115 universities in the UK on their attitude to free speech. So if they're really bad, we give them a red. If they're pretty bad, we give them an amber. And if they've got no policies, are totally hands off and don't intervene into what students can and can't say, then we give them a green. And, this time we've been doing it 3 years. So for 2017, we found that 94% of universities and students' unions censor speech in some way. So, you cannot, as a student, speak freely on the vast majority of university campuses in the UK, which is shocking. And it's gone up and up over the last 3 years. I think it started at something around 80%, and then it was 90%, now it's 94%. So it's an endemic problem that students are being censored much more regularly. And where that's come from is really mainly students' unions. This year especially, we found that university administrations are getting a bit worse and implementing more policies, and thinking of policies like they call bullying and harassment policies, which, ban offensive gestures or speech that can be deemed to be offensive. So take from that what you will, it could be anything. But it's students' unions that really put the bans in place, and they're kind of, along with the National Union of Students, the NUS, are acting as essentially campus PC police, and would and have banned people like Lawyer Annapolis from campus, have stopped debates happening. Different SUs have put in different bans on all number of ridiculous things, from Sombreros to Pole Society to debates on abortion. And for a student today going to a UK university, it would be very hard to go and be able to speak freely, because the state of campus censorship is dire.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me as well that we're not really preparing these students for the real world. We're constructing this infant-like safe space where no mean things can be heard or said, and then they're being thrown out into the real world where them safeguards just do not exist at all, and they're going to be completely unequipped to function as adults.
Exactly. the university should be a place that fosters debate, that encourages the challenge, the kind of clash and challenging of ideas, simply because it's where a lot of new ideas are formed, certainly a lot of new theories, a lot of new understandings of how the world works have come from debates and study, and that is what's supposed to happen at university. Furthermore, if a student is comes out of school, which is obviously protected in a different way, and enters the world as an adult and starts at, some of them when they're 18 and go straight to university, don't have any sense of what's going on in the wider world because their university has a safe space policy, has a no platform policy. There will never be ideas that they haven't heard before on campus because there's rules in place that mean that for example, someone like Tommy Robinson can't come and speak, or some Islamist preacher can't come speak, or some other kind of very controversial speaker can't come, or they can't tell rude jokes on campus or anything like that. So they have a very kind of bubble-wrapped experience at university. 3 years go by, they leave uni and they go out into the world, and obviously none of those rules apply anymore, and normal life hits them like a ton of bricks.
Brutal.
Yeah, and that's not to say that we have a society that's sort of rife with all these bad things and that we have to prepare students for the big bad world, because that's not the case either. But they basically come out as Philistines, I think, really. They come out as people who are completely incapable, their minds and their ideas challenged. They're unable to take criticism, they're unable to take debate. And that is just a kind of that's sort of a real dire sentence for a young generation, to not be able to challenge and think for themselves. And more importantly, it's a real dire indictment for politics, because you have a young generation who are coming to their sort of first political experiences without all the information at hand, without all the ideas and different opinions exposed to them. So it then fosters this idea that politics should be a sort of very safe one sort of narrative affair, rather than actually a play and clash of ideas.
I agree. I mean, going a little further back to what we was talking about, you mentioned the word sombrero, and it reminded me, or triggered me rather, that you've recently put an article up about cultural appropriation, and that's something I don't believe I've covered on this podcast, and I thought maybe you could just explain what people mean by that term and how they're trying to enforce rules against things like the sombrero or native Indian headgear and things like that.
Well, I'll take the example of what was written about in the piece, because that was a kind of nice example. So what happened was that Vogue magazine, a fashion magazine, ran a shoot which was meant to be themed around Japan, and they cast a white American model in the role of a Japanese woman, and she dressed as a geisha. Now, this was people decried this as racist. They said that she was doing what they called yellow face, like blackface, and said that it was really wrong that Vogue had done this. And it was called cultural appropriation. And the argument behind cultural appropriation is where essentially it's meant to be that when people take on and abuse other people's cultures, but really what it is white people kind of copying or using other cultures to their own sort of for their own use. So a white American model dressing up as a geisha would be cultural appropriation because she's appropriating that culture, the argument goes. But of course, what's actually happening is that it's sort of what you guess you could call cultural appreciation. It's mixing of cultures, it's fusion, it's playing around. And, in this example, I mean, Vogue didn't do itself any favors because it was a diversity issue. So that's what it called itself. So Vogue was playing in this can of worms anyway, and sort of kicked it all over when it did this stupid, knowing the climate, it was a pretty stupid move to make. Why couldn't you have just got a Japanese model? If you're doing a diversity issue, it seems a bit of a daft mistake to make. So, but this kind of, basically what it means is that you can't have or can't express yourself in any way that isn't the cultural heritage you were born into. And so, I'm second generation Irish, so the kind of cultural heritages I have is Irish and a bit of English, and that's fairly limited. I mean, I love Ireland, but it's not exactly sort of a hugely diverse and exciting culture, which is fine because I can be interested in and play around with lots of other cultures. People talk about how wonderful London is because it's multicultural and that people share in each other's cultures, and you get fusion and you get all sorts of new and exciting things. But for some reason, this is being turned on its head with cultural appropriation. And what it really is this kind of victim culture that is playing on identity politics. And you then have ridiculous things like there was a move at one university or calls from students in America which said that yoga shouldn't be practiced by anybody because it was cultural appropriation, that you shouldn't eat sushi because it's cultural appropriation. I mean, what a boring world we would live in if we had to stick to the sort of practices and traditions that we were born with. What a sort of dull thing to do, and what a sort of really anti-universalist and anti-cosmopolitan thing to suggest.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to show how comfortable campuses are in the way that these are the big issues of the day for some people.
Yeah, I mean, the campus example of the Sombreros one was they didn't allow students to hand out free sombreros during Freshers Week because it was cultural appropriation of Mexican people and was offensive to Mexican people. And in fact, it's as if it was the first time anybody ever tried to wear a sombrero, that this was some kind of huge revelation that, sombreros might mean something else. Of course, it's completely ridiculous. And I'm sure any Mexican student at that university would have said, I don't mind if they wear sombreros. And it's just crass, actually. It's just really crass. It's attention seeking, and it's really negative and nasty and sort of nitpicky and ridiculous. And it's insulting because it's painting normal students who just want to have a laugh, in this case, just want to wear a sombrero, as having ulterior racist motives, which is a terrible thing.
Agreed. I mean, would you say, for instance, that the emergence of some free speech societies on campuses might be a good antidote to this kind of thing?
Certainly. We've got free speech university societies popping up all over the UK. There's one in Aberystwyth, there's one in LSE, there's one in Queen Mary's, both in London. There's one up in Leeds and in Bristol. They're popping up all over the place, up in Edinburgh too, because students are really sick of being told what they can and can't say on campus. And they're organising and they're kind of doing what you think student politics should be about, which is kicking against the pricks kind of thing. And they're standing up for free speech and they're demanding that they be treated like free adults in a free society. And I just think that's wonderful. And I just, it's been a while since I was graduated, but God, if I had something like that when I was at university, I would have loved it, because it's such a sort of positive reclaiming of politics and a positive reclaiming of what student politics should be.
Yeah, it's a perfect time. I mean, are you positive then about the future of this? Do you think it's just a period in time that will pass, or do you think it's going to progress to something slightly more draconian? On
the one hand, if things keep going the way they're going without any challenge, it's a bleak kind of picture, because it's sort of the isolation, anti-universalist, anti-humanist nature of all of this means that people are just going to be driven into their own little boxes and not allowed to leave their own little identity sort of sections. And that's a terrible thing that I don't think anybody wants. But to be honest, the backlash has started. It started sort of a year ago, and I think it's growing. I think more and more people are sort of realizing that this has actually gone way too far, and the focus on identity politics has become so crazy. And it's, the interesting thing is when Brexit happened, you suddenly we weren't getting news of sort of crazy campus bans or somebody talking about gender neutral toilets or, somebody taking offense to something somebody said on Twitter anymore, because real politics was happening. Trump got elected, that was real politics.
Pronouns hit the back page that week, didn't they?
Yeah. And I think that's important, because this is petty crap that needs to be treated like that. And we need to focus on the big political questions of our time. Questions around immigration, questions around democracy, questions around the economy, Brexit, especially in the UK. There's so much stuff that we need to talk about as a political public. And people don't want to talk about these couple of nuts students or these couple of nuts sort of gender activists, because it's not interesting. And so I hope that kind of this spell of a fascination with identity politics is beginning to ebb.
I put out a tweet before just to see if anyone had any questions for you, and a Twitter user called The Mig has asked, where's the greatest threat to free speech coming from right now?
I'd say it's in the UK, it's the government. I think that simply because the state has all the power to take away our free speech, obviously. And they are listening to the state, and politicians are listening to the carping of ridiculous media commentators who are panicking about trolls, and are taking this seriously. You have politicians, some of whom I've mentioned already, who are calling for regulation, who are calling for police involvement in people's private lives. And so, when you have our Prime Minister at the moment, Theresa May, is potentially the worst person for freedom of speech. She, loves curtailing internet freedom. She loves deporting people. She hates freedom. She really doesn't like it. If you could kind of caricature her, you'd just say Theresa May is not a freedom lover. And so that's what frightens me. The odd, article in the New Statesman crying about sort of people being mean on social media. I don't care about that. That's silly. But when the state starts listening and starts putting in things like hate speech laws, that's when you got to get freaked out, I think.
Agreed. Okay, Ella. Well, thank you very much for speaking to me. Is there anything that I've not touched on that you'd like to get in at all?
No, I think that's been really great conversation. Thanks so much.
No, completely my pleasure. And thank you for being such a staunch advocate of freedom of expression. I'm always very pleased to see you when you're on the big questions or elsewhere. I think we need more people with that viewpoint.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Hopefully we will.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. From here, you can either become a Patreon subscriber, or you can give a one-off donation through PayPal, or you can just follow some instructions on how best to share the podcast on social media. Put it on a memory stick, throw it at people, whatever works best. Any support's greatly appreciated. I think we've all learned something here today.